Hello, thanks for stopping by, and welcome to part 2 of making a Revolutionary War costume using a vintage pattern from the Bicentennial 1976. If you missed the first video, that's okay. We just went through the types of fabric that I will be using for this project, and I attempted to dye some of those, but not very successfully. Then we went through a couple of versions of the waistcoat, but the last one came out nicely. In this video, we are going to go through making the breeches and the 18th century shirt, which is much floofier and lacier than modern menswear shirts. In between those two pieces, just to give this pattern and this project a little bit more context, we will take a look at what the American Bicentennial was and what it was really like. But now let's dive right into making the breeches. I started by cutting the pieces out. For this, I was trying to salvage enough fabric to also make a second waistcoat, and I just eked it out. The first stages of the construction for these breeches was fairly simple. Pin the front two pieces together and sew the center front crotch seam. Then there were two decorative pieces that I made and top stitched onto the front. I think these sort of mimic the look of the original flap front that would have been period correct. Then I sort of attached on a combination waistband and facing, which was kind of interesting. And I pinned a piece of twill tape into that as well to give extra structure to the waist. And all of that gets sewn together. So you end up with a facing that is the waistband, which is kind of unique. I haven't encountered that before, but it worked out really well. Then I did the very same thing for the back pieces. You basically end up with closed mirrors for the front and back. The interesting thing is that you end up with little side facings on either side of the front and back. At the top and bottom, so these end up being button stands where you button the breeches together both around the calf and at the waist. So once I had the front and back panels made, I stitched them together sort of the center between the two panels, and then finished off the button panels with top stitching. After the waistband and the side seams were done, I just had to go through and do the sort of inner leg seam, the one that goes from like inner ankle up through the crotch and down to the other inner ankle. I also decided to go ahead and add some of the machine embroidery onto those decorative pieces on the front that will mirror the same that I used on the waistcoat. After that, I made a couple of leg bands that go at the bottom of the breeches that will tighten around the calves, and obviously just pinned those on there, stitched them on and flipped them. Then it was time for the most daunting part of this project, which was the buttonholes. And there were 14 in total, 8 on the top, 6 on the bottom. But luckily my machine powered through them really nicely and I didn't have a lot of trouble. That was it for the construction of the breeches. It was actually a very simple process. I once would have been very intimidated by this, but I have tried my hand at a few historical pants before, and I realized that they're actually much simpler to make than modern pants. And modern pants don't intimidate me that much anymore either. I've just done them a few times. I'm not saying I'm that great at them, but I'm not intimidated by them, which two different concepts. Once I got into this project, I started becoming much more aware of this being a 1970s costume pattern rather than something that's attempting to be historically accurate. And that actually got me interested in the Bicentennial and this idea of historic costuming in the 1970s and what it looked like then. So I decided to research the Bicentennial just a little bit. I've always been vaguely aware that it happened, but I didn't know much more about it. I asked a few people who were alive and remember it well, and their memories aren't necessarily the fondest of the whole situation. It seems like it was pretty common for people to be annoyed by the whole thing, tired of seeing cheesy programs on TV. Their options were a lot more limited then, so they were probably forced to watch some bicentennial themed programming that they didn't like that much. I personally had always assumed that it was just sort of very heavy patriotic propaganda, and I think it was quite a bit of that, but there was actually some more depth to it that I wasn't expecting to find. As I dug a little bit more into it, I found that there were some genuine efforts to stimulate productive civic discourse and to generate a little bit more interest in history and politics. It's important to keep in mind that this bicentennial celebration was happening during a time of tremendous political upheaval here in the US. We had just gotten out of the Vietnam War. The Nixon presidency had just recently ended in disgrace. It definitely makes sense that a celebration of the American Bicentennial would have been met with mixed reactions at the time, ranging from people embracing it to people just ignoring it, to people actively loathing it. I was able to find a list of every bicentennial project that happened in every city in America, and it really was a very wide range. I was really surprised that the bicentennial celebration was so much broader than I had ever realized. While I was looking into the bicentennial a little bit and thinking about the costumes people had made to celebrate it, it got me wondering how much of an effect this celebration had to develop an interest in historical costuming that maybe didn't exist prior. There were definitely a lot of people buying these costume patterns and making these costumes at home for their sort of proto-cosplay patriotic celebrations. There was also a lot of financial support coming from the federal government to upgrade and create new museums, to support local historical societies, to help develop scholarly essays on American history, things like that. So all of this had to help really foster some level of improved understanding of history and interest in it, and the celebrations and sewing patterns were an element of that sort of locked together hand in hand. This is definitely an idea that could have dragged me down into a research rabbit hole if I let it, but for now I decided to leave it at a kernel of an idea and move on. With that being said, I returned to the sewing project with a newfound appreciation of the 1970s does 1770s aspect of the pattern. It may be a bit of a cheesy modern costume pattern, but I started to find that interesting in and of itself. And with a recently recharged interest in the history of the project, I decided to try hand sewing this entire shirt, which I have never done before, and my hand sewing skills are atrocious, or were atrocious. They've improved a bit after I started on this shirt, but let's get into it. I started with the front piece, and that requires lace to be attached to the center front. So I cut out the correct sizes of lace, and here I'm just finishing off the edges of it with a buttonhole stitch, then hand stitching the lace onto the shirt front. After that, I cut out the back pieces for the shirt, and then I sewed the center back seam about 2/3 of the way up, with the top third being left open. This was pretty rough. I was using white thread on white fabric, and I'd never hand sewed a seam before, and I had a little bit of trouble with it. I was trying to do a back stitch, but my stitches weren't that neat. So you see here, once I finished the center back seam, I pressed the seam allowances open, and the top third, I turned the edges of it under, which created sort of a facing. Then it was time to do the shoulder seams, very simple. And my hand sewing skills improved slightly by now. I did, however, switch to a light gray thread instead of white, just so it would be easier for me to see and help keep my stitches neat as a beginning hand sewist. This had the downside of being slightly visible, but I'm happy enough with it. I also went through and hand felled all of the seam allowances on the shoulder seams. Still riding the struggle bus with the hand sewing, but getting better. The collar was very simple. You just assemble it like normal with interfacing on one side. You attach the interface side to the shirt body, then flip up the collar and slip stitch the uninterfaced side down to where you're sort of encasing the raw edge to where it's not visible. After that, it was time to make the sleeves, and I encountered a bit of a problem here. So I cut out the sleeves and I hand sewed on a piece of lace at the bottom, which would be the wristband, sort of like wrist ruffle lace thing. Anyways, so then I realized it was entirely too short, and I figured out that the sewing pattern had been cut along the lengthen or shorten line, and I had only cut out the sleeve length to the top piece without the bottom, and I didn't have enough fabric to completely redraft the sleeves. So what I did here was cut an additional piece with the missing length and just pieced it onto the end of the sleeves. There wasn't much else I could do. I did, however, decide to make the best of a bad situation, and I added some more of that decorative machine embroidery over the seam where the two sleeve pieces had been pieced together, just to make it look a little bit more intentional and to make the shirt a little bit more cohesive with the rest of the outfit. And I'm actually pretty happy with how it came out. It looks pretty nice. After that, 2 layers of lace were added to the bottom of the new sleeve, It is important to note that at this point I got tired of hand sewing, gave up on it completely, and switched back to the machine. So when the lace was added onto the cuff, a fairly wide seam allowance was left, and that is being folded back up to create a channel, which will be used to add elastic. And once the channel was pressed into place, it was just top stitched down. Then it was time to add on the sleeves. This just involved gathering the sleeve cap in the center a little bit. Nothing too extraordinary there, although I really hate gathering. I got a little bit better at this time since my hand sewing skills improved marginally, but it's still not my favorite thing to do. Because there were about 8.5 million pins in the gathering, I decided to machine baste first, where I just went over the pins. The machine stitch length was set on its very longest length, and I was careful. I didn't hit any of the pins. I never do when I machine baste, but for me that's just much easier. So when I do the actual construction stitch, I can, pull out all the pins and I can just zoom through the construction stitch without having to slow down for them. Then it was time to feed the elastic through the wristband casings, and this was accomplished by taking a big honkin' needle and sewing it to one end of the elastic, then feeding that through the casing and using it to pull the elastic through, and then stitching the elastic down to either end of the casing. Then it was time for the underarm sleeve. Pretty straightforward. The shirt was done with the sleeves on the flat rather than being set in, which is always my favorite. There wasn't an arm side on the body, so attaching the sleeves on flat was kind of weird, but it worked out just fine. I did end up clipping the seam allowance a little bit just to get everything to lay flat and sew together. And after that, it was just hemming and the shirt was done. This was a really fun part of the project. I enjoyed the hand sewing much more than I expected to. I am happy with the way both garments came out, and I am looking forward to making the jacket. In the next video, we will go through re-dyeing the fabric. I am going to cut the pieces for it first, then re-dye it. So heaven help me, I hope that works out well. I thought it was interesting to look back to 1976, America's Bicentennial. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a like, and if you have not already, please consider subscribing. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the future.